The night was unusually still when Daniel Whitmore's car rolled up the long driveway of his estate. The tires whispered over the stone path, a sound he hadn't heard in weeks. His return was supposed to be a surprise, not a warm reunion, but simply a businessman arriving ahead of schedule. That was who he was, punctual, efficient, always in control. Yet as he stepped out of the car and looked up at the mansion, a strange feeling pressed against his chest. The house should have been silent. It should have greeted him with emptiness, the way it always did when he came home from his endless travels. Inside, the marble floor echoed beneath his polished shoes. He loosened his tie, set his briefcase down, and prepared himself for the kind of silence he had grown used to, a silence that reminded him of how much space money could buy and how little warmth it held. But then it happened. A faint sound broke the stillness. At first, Daniel thought it was the wind, a trick of the night seeping through the hallways, but no. It was deliberate. A low murmur, almost melodic, weaving through the air. He froze, his jaw tightening. It was coming from upstairs. He knew the house was staffed, but this sound was different. It wasn't footsteps or chores being done. It was singing. No, praying. His pulse quickened. Daniel's mind raced through possibilities. Who would be in his mother's room at this hour? He had left her in the care of professionals, doctors, nurses, a carefully designed schedule. There was no space in that plan for whispered hymns. He moved up the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. The closer he got, the clearer the sound became. A woman's voice, soft, steady, filled with a kind of tenderness he hadn't heard in years. The words were old hymns, the kind his mother used to hum when he was a child, before her mind had started slipping into shadows. His hand hovered over the doorknob. For a moment he considered turning back. He hated surprises, and yet something inside him pushed forward. With a quick breath, he turned the handle and stepped inside. The sight stopped him cold. There, at the edge of his mother's bed, knelt Grace Williams, the black housekeeper he had barely noticed in his comings and goings. The woman he thought of only in terms of duties performed was on her knees. Her hands were wrapped around Helena Whitmore's frail fingers. Her head was bowed, lips moving in prayer, her voice rising and falling like waves. And his mother, who rarely recognized even her own son these days, was holding tightly to Grace's hand, her eyes moist, her lips trembling with words Daniel couldn't hear. For a long moment, Daniel couldn't move. The man who closed deals worth millions with a single handshake, the man who walked into boardrooms without flinching, was suddenly rooted to the floor by the simple sight of his mother and her housekeeper. Anger rose in him first. What gave Grace the right to kneel there, to hold his mother in such intimacy, to speak words that had been absent from this house since his father banned them years ago? He opened his mouth to demand an explanation, but nothing came out. The air in the room felt heavy, sacred even, and he was an intruder. Helena stirred, her eyes flickering. For a brief second they found Daniel's, and then, clear as day, with a softness he hadn't heard in years, she whispered his childhood nickname, Danny. The word cut through him like glass. She hadn't said his name with recognition in months, not to him, yet here she was, holding Grace's hand, whispering his name as if the prayer had pulled it from the depths of her fading memory. Daniel's chest tightened, his throat burned. He wanted to believe it was coincidence, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. Something about Grace's presence had unlocked a part of his mother he thought was gone forever. And for the first time in a very long time, Daniel Whitmore, the man who thought he had seen everything, was stunned into silence. Daniel's hand tightened against the doorframe as if he needed something solid to keep from unraveling. The word still echoed in his chest, Danny. His mother hadn't called him that in years. Not through all the carefully monitored visits, not through the endless cycles of confusion and blank stares. But tonight, with Grace kneeling at her bedside, it came alive again. He cleared his throat, forcing his voice into the sharpness that had carried him through boardrooms and battles. What exactly is going on here? Grace lifted her head slowly. Her eyes, calm and steady, met his without flinching. She did not look guilty, though he had expected her to. She looked grounded. Your mother was frightened, she said softly. She couldn't sleep. I prayed with her to ease her mind. Daniel stepped fully into the room, his shadow stretching across the bed. Prayed? The word sounded foreign on his tongue, bitter almost. This is not a church. It's my home. You're here to work, not... His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed forward. Not to involve her in... this. Grace's lips pressed together, but she didn't drop her gaze. She remained by Helena's side, her hand still resting gently over the frail fingers. "Mr. Whitmore," she said evenly, "your mother is more than a patient. She's a woman who carries memories, fears, and loneliness. Prayer brings her peace when nothing else does." Her tone, respectful yet unshaken, unnerved him. Most employees shrank under his glare, but Grace seemed anchored to something deeper than fear of losing her job. Daniel's eyes flicked to his mother. Helena's lips were moving faintly, as if still caught in the rhythm of the hymn. He wanted to believe this was nothing, a coincidence, a fleeting spark of memory that meant Liquo battle, but the sound of his childhood name had pierced too deep. He felt exposed, almost powerless, and that made his anger burn hotter. "You're overstepping," he said coldly. "I hired you to keep the house in order, not to play spiritual guide." For the first time, Grace stood. She moved with quiet dignity, her hand lingering on Helena's before letting go. "With respect, sir," she said, "when your mother trembles in the night, when she wakes not knowing where she is or who she is, I am the one beside her. If a prayer eases her, if it helps her remember even for a moment, I will not withhold it." The boldness in her voice startled him. His instinct was to cut her down with the kind of words that ended arguments before they began. Yet as he opened his mouth, Helena stirred again. Her frail voice, thin as glass, slipped between them. "Danny, don't fight." The words froze him. She was looking at him, really looking, her eyes shimmering with a clarity he hadn't seen in years. And still, her fingers reached toward Grace, as if she couldn't bear to lose her touch. Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in decades, the ground beneath his confidence cracking. The power he wore like armor faltered under the weight of his mother's fragile plea. Grace adjusted the blanket over Helena's shoulders, her movements careful, almost reverent. Then she turned back to him. "She needs you, Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly. "But she also needs compassion. Sometimes compassion looks like prayer." For a long moment, Daniel couldn't speak. The man who prided himself on knowing every move, every calculation, was suddenly caught in a space he couldn't control. His mother's room, where whispered prayers had more power than all his wealth. And though he would never admit it out loud, something in him knew this was only the beginning of a battle he wasn't prepared to fight. Daniel hardly slept that night. He poured himself a glass of scotch in the study, but the amber liquid burned in his throat without softening the edges of what he had witnessed. Every time he closed his eyes, the image returned. Grace kneeling beside his mother, her hand holding Helena's as though she were family. And worse than that, the sound of his mother's voice, clear and sharp, breaking through the fog of her illness, to call him Danny. He had been trained to dismiss feelings, to cage them until they lost their power. His father had drilled it into him since childhood. "Emotions are weaknesses, son. They cloud judgment. Don't ever let them rule you." Those words had shaped him, hardened him. He had built an empire on that foundation. Yet tonight, standing in his own home, he had felt like a child again, caught off guard, vulnerable, staring at something he couldn't control. Daniel leaned back in his leather chair and let his eyes roam the room. The study was a monument to his father's taste. Dark mahogany shelves lined with law books, trophies from deals won, photos of men in suits shaking hands. There was no warmth here, no trace of his mother's gentle touch. The only softness in this house had been Helena herself before the illness began stealing her away piece by piece. And now, impossibly, Grace Williams was breathing life back into that softness in ways Daniel couldn't explain. It unsettled him. Grace had been in his mother's service for years, quiet and efficient. He had always thought of her as part of the house, like the polished floors or the chandeliers, present but not to be noticed. Yet the way Helena clung to her tonight, the way Grace looked back at him without fear, it forced him to see her differently, and that made him angry. At dawn, he went to check on his mother. He expected to find her in her usual state, half asleep, distant, barely aware of the world around her. Instead, he found her humming softly, her frail hands folded neatly on the blanket. Grace was by the window, adjusting the curtains to let in a stream of sunlight. The room felt alive, as though someone had breathed color back into it overnight. Daniel stood there longer than he meant to, watching. Grace turned and caught his eye. She didn't flinch or fumble as most employees did when confronted by him. She simply said, "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore." Her voice carried no apology for the night before. He should have dismissed her right then. He should have told her to remember her place, to stick to her duties. But instead, he found himself asking, "How long have you been sitting with her like this?" Grace hesitated, then answered honestly, "Every night she wakes. Sometimes she calls for you, sometimes she doesn't know where she is. I stay until she falls asleep again." Her words landed like a stone in his chest. He tried to ignore it, tried to push back with logic. "That's not your job," he said sharply. "You're paid to manage the household, not this." Grace met his glare calmly. "With respect, sir, someone has to care for her as a person, not just as a responsibility." The defiance stung him. No one spoke to him this way, yet her tone wasn't rebellious. It was steady, almost protective of Helena against him. Daniel left the room without another word, but the conversation stayed with him long after. For the first time, he wondered if Grace knew his mother better than he ever had. The thought gnawed at him. It wasn't just unsettling, it was humiliating. And in the quiet recesses of his mind, a dangerous question began to form. What if Grace held more of his family's truth than he did? The house was quiet that night, but Daniel couldn't rest. Sleep had become impossible in the days since his return. The image of Grace kneeling by his mother's bed, the way Helena's fingers clung to hers, replayed in his mind like a scene on loop. No deal, no contract, no boardroom conquest had ever rattled him the way this did. Restless, he wandered the halls. The silence pressed against his ears, heavy and suffocating, until he found himself drifting toward his mother's wing of the house. He told himself it was to check on her, out of duty, not affection. That's what he wanted to believe. But deep down, something else pulled him there. As he approached, he slowed. A faint voice drifted into the hallway. His mother's. Daniel froze. Helena's voice had grown so rare, her words usually broken, fragile things. But now, carried on the air, was the clear rhythm of conversation. He edged closer, careful not to let the floor creak under his weight. Inside, Grace's gentle murmur guided his mother like a steady hand. She spoke with patience, coaxing Helena's thoughts into focus. And then Helena's frail, trembling voice began to spill things Daniel wasn't supposed to hear. "Your father," Helena whispered. "He thought money could fix everything, but he broke things no money could mend." Grace's tone was low, soothing. "You're safe now, Mrs. Whitmore. You don't have to carry those burdens alone." But Helena pressed on, her voice fragile yet determined. "There were nights he didn't come home. Meetings," he said. "Always meetings. But I knew about the other women. And when I tried to confront him..." Her voice caught, the words dissolving into tears. "He said no one would believe me, not even Danny." Daniel's heart stopped, his hand clenched against the wall. The weight of the confession pressed down on him like a collapsing ceiling. His mother's secrets, hidden for decades, buried under the immaculate surface of the Whitmore name, were unraveling in the quiet of her bedroom, with Grace as the keeper of her truth. Grace's voice, steady and warm, filled the silence. "You were stronger than he ever gave you credit for. Don't carry his sins as your own." Helena sighed, a sound filled with years of exhaustion. "Danny deserves better. He deserved love, not lessons in cruelty. But I was too afraid. Too silent." Daniel staggered back from the doorway, his breath ragged. He had spent years modeling himself after his father, believing coldness was power, that emotion was weakness. But now, hearing his mother's pain laid bare, he realized that what he had admired was nothing more than control built on fear. And Grace, this woman he had barely acknowledged, was not only his mother's comfort, but also her confessor. She knew pieces of Helena's truth that he had never been trusted with. That stung worse than any insult. He wanted to burst into the room, to demand that Grace stop filling his mother's head with memories best forgotten. But he couldn't. His legs wouldn't carry him. He stood frozen in the hallway, powerless, listening to the foundations of his family legacy crack beneath the weight of whispered prayers and painful confessions. For the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore felt like a stranger in his own home. Dinner at the Whitmore estate had always been an exercise in formality. Even when Helena had been in better health, the dining room was a stage where appearances mattered more than comfort. Tonight, Daniel thought, would be no different. He insisted his mother join him at the long mahogany table, determined to restore some sense of order, determined perhaps to prove that he could handle her care without Grace's interference. The room glowed with candlelight, the clink of silver against porcelain echoing faintly in the cavernous silence. Helena sat at the far end, fragile and pale, her hands trembling as she tried to hold her fork. Grace hovered discreetly nearby, ready to assist. Daniel waved her off. "We can manage," he said firmly, his eyes fixed on Grace rather than his mother. Helena's hand shook as she lifted a piece of chicken. The fork slipped, clattering against the plate. A sharp tremor passed through her body. She pressed her hand to her temple, blinking rapidly as confusion clouded her face. "Mother, it's fine," Daniel said, forcing his tone into something soothing, though it carried more impatience than care. "Just eat slowly." But Helena's breathing grew uneven. Her lips trembled, her eyes darting as if she were trapped in a place he couldn't see. Then, with a sudden gasp, she slumped sideways in her chair. "Mother!" Daniel shot up, his voice cracking. His polished composure shattered as panic surged through him. He rushed to her side, but his movements were clumsy, frantic. "What do I—" His words broke off. He didn't know what to do. Grace was already there. Her hands moved with practiced certainty, easing Helena back, checking her pulse, lifting her chin gently. "She's having an episode," Grace said firmly. "Step back." Daniel bristled. "No, Step back." Grace's voice cut through his panic like a blade. She didn't shout, but the command car rides such authority that he obeyed without thinking. Grace tilted Helena's head, speaking softly, almost singing under her breath. Her movements were steady, methodical. She loosened Helena's collar, placed a damp cloth against her forehead, and murmured words of comfort Daniel could barely hear. Slowly, Helena's breathing began to ease, the tightness in her face softening. Daniel stood helplessly, his hands hanging useless by his sides. The helplessness was unbearable. He, who negotiated billion-dollar deals, who bent men twice his age to his will, couldn't steady his own mother's hand or calm her breaking body. And there, right before his eyes, Grace was doing what he could not. Minutes passed, heavy as hours, until Helena's breathing evened out. Grace tucked the blanket tighter around her frail frame, brushing a stray lock of silver hair from her forehead with a tenderness that pierced Daniel to the core. "She'll be all right," Grace whispered, "but no more strain. Forcing her into formal dinners isn't what she needs. She needs calm, familiarity, gentle care." Daniel swallowed hard. His throat felt tight, his pride choking him. He wanted to argue, to remind Grace who owned this house, who gave her orders. But the truth lay before him, undeniable. His mother clung to Grace, her trembling hand grasping the housekeeper's wrist, not his. For the first time, Daniel saw himself as his mother must see him, a distant figure, unfamiliar, a man who came and went with the seasons. And Grace was the constant, the anchor, the one Helena trusted in her most vulnerable moments. The weight of that realization pressed on his chest. He hated it. He hated how right she was. And yet, beneath the anger, something else stirred, a hollow ache he had ignored for too long. That night, Daniel sat awake in his study again, staring into the dark glass of his drink. The sound of his mother's labored breathing haunted him, along with the image of Grace kneeling. Not in prayer this time, but in action, doing what he couldn't. For the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore questioned not just his control, but his worth as a son. The study was cloaked in shadows, the only light spilling from a single lamp on the desk. Daniel sat there long after the house had gone still, his shoulders hunched, a glass of untouched scotch sweating against his palm. The night's events replayed in his mind with brutal clarity, his mother slumping at the dinner table, his own panic, Grace's firm voice cutting through his helplessness. It gnawed at him. He, Daniel Whitmore, who had stared down governors and CEOs, had frozen when his own mother collapsed, and Grace Williams, his housekeeper, had stepped into the role he should have filled without hesitation. That humiliation festered inside him, burning hotter with each passing minute. He slammed the glass down, the sharp crack echoing off the mahogany shelves. "Damn it," he muttered, his voice low but heavy. His reflection in the darkened window stared back at him, hard lines, expensive suit, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. For a fleeting second, he saw not a titan of industry but a boy again, small beneath his father's disapproving gaze. "Emotions are weakness," his father's voice whispered from memory. "You don't cry. You don't bend. You win." A rustle at the door broke his spiral. Grace stood there, her posture quiet but steady, as if she had been waiting for him. She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. "You shouldn't bottle this up," she said gently. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't be here." Her gaze didn't waver. "And yet I am, because your mother isn't the only one who needs care right now." The words struck him like a slap. He shot to his feet. "Care?" His laugh was sharp, bitter. "I don't need care. I don't need prayer. What I need is order in my house, and right now it feels like I'm losing control of everything." Grace didn't flinch at his anger. She stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. "Control isn't love, Mr. Whitmore. Your mother doesn't need order. She needs presence. And so do you." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. "Don't you dare lecture me. You think because you sit at her bedside and whisper prayers, you know more about this family than I do? You think you've earned the right to tell me what kind of son I should be?" Grace's eyes softened, but her words cut deeper than any rebuke. "I don't think, sir. I know. Because I've seen your mother cry for you when you weren't here. I've heard her call your name into the night, even when she didn't know her own. I've prayed for her peace, but I've also prayed for you, that you might find your way back before it's too late." Daniel's chest tightened, the air in the room thick as stone. Her words dug past his armor, past the defenses he had spent a lifetime building. Something inside him cracked, though he fought to keep it hidden. "You presume too much," he said finally, his voice low, almost hoarse. Grace didn't retreat. She simply placed her hand lightly on the back of a chair, steady as a rock. "No, Mr. Whitmore, I see too much. That's the difference." The silence that followed was unbearable. Daniel turned away, unwilling to let her see the storm in his eyes. Yet her words lingered, haunting him with their quiet truth. For the first time in decades, someone had dared to speak to him not as a billionaire, not as a man of power, but as a son who had forgotten how to be present. And the worst part was, he couldn't dismiss it. The morning light spilled through the tall windows of Helena's room, soft and golden. Daniel lingered in the doorway, his suit jacket draped over one arm, as though he couldn't decide whether to step inside or retreat to the safety of his office downtown. The air in the room was different now, warmer somehow, touched by something he couldn't quite name. Helena was propped up on pillows, her silver hair brushed neatly. Grace sat beside her, spooning broth gently to her lips. The sight made something twist in Daniel's chest. He told himself it was gratitude, but underneath lurked an ache he couldn't shake. "Good morning, Mother," Daniel said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. Helena's cloudy eyes flickered, then, shockingly, sharpened. For a moment, they were clear, piercing, just as they had been when he was a boy hiding under the dining table during one of his father's rages. She blinked at him, and a fragile smile tugged at her lips. "Danny," she whispered, the name again. Each time she said it, it carved deeper into him. He forced a smile, stepping closer. "Yes, Mother, I'm here." Her gaze drifted briefly to Grace, then back to him. "You work too much," Helena said softly, her voice trembling but lucid. "Always gone, always rushing. Do you ever stop long enough to see me?" The words lodged in his throat. He glanced at Grace, who lowered her eyes as though giving him the space to answer. But there was no easy answer. The truth sat heavy on his shoulders. He hadn't seen her, not really, not in years. I'm here now," he managed, the words brittle. Helena's thin hand reached out, but not to him. She found Grace's wrist instead, clinging with surprising strength. "She sees me," Helena said, her voice cracking. "When I am lost, she finds me. When I am afraid, she prays with me. She is my anchor." The statement sliced through Daniel like a blade, his chest constricted, shame flooding him in waves. He wanted to protest, to insist that he, her son, was her anchor. But the evidence was undeniable. Grace was the one she clung to, the one who brought her back from the fog. "Mother." Daniel's voice faltered. He reached for her hand, but she didn't let go of Grace's. Instead, she turned her gaze on him, clear and unflinching. "You're my son," she whispered, "but she has been my daughter in your absence." The room seemed to tilt beneath him. Daniel had spent a lifetime commanding respect, building an empire brick by brick. Yet in this quiet bedroom, with sunlight falling across the quilt, his own mother had spoken the truth he had buried for too long. Love was not measured in titles, power, or wealth. It was measured in presence, and Grace had given what he had withheld. His throat burned. He wanted to shout, to deny it, to restore the image of himself as the provider, the protector. But the words would not come. Instead, all he felt was the weight of everything he had missed, everything Grace had quietly carried in his place. Helena's eyes began to cloud again, the lucidity slipping. She murmured softly, almost dreamlike, "Don't leave me alone, Danny. Don't let me go." Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, finally taking her free hand, though she still held fast to Grace. He swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "I won't, Mother. I promise." Grace's steady presence beside them was undeniable. For the first time, Daniel understood that this battle wasn't between him and her. It was between the man he had been and the man he needed to become. The night air was heavy with silence when Daniel finally sought Grace out. He found her in the small sitting room adjacent to his mother's quarters, folding linens with the same care she showed in everything she did. For a moment, he simply stood in the doorway, watching. Her movements were unhurried, precise, almost reverent. She didn't just do a task, she honored it. He cleared his throat, though the sound came out rougher than he intended. "Grace." She looked up, her expression calm but unreadable. "Mr. Whitmore." He stepped inside, his hands buried in his pockets to hide the tension in them. For once, he wasn't sure how to begin. Words that usually came so easily to him, the commands, the dismissals, the sharp negotiations, felt clumsy on his tongue. He exhaled slowly. I need your help. Her brow furrowed slightly, but she said nothing, waiting. Daniel forced himself to meet her gaze. I don't know how to do this. With my mother. He hesitated, searching for words that didn't sound like weakness. With being present, she reached for you, not me. She trusts you in ways she doesn't trust her own son. And I can't stand that, Grace, but I can't deny it either. Grace set the folded linens aside and rose to her feet. There was no triumph in her eyes, no satisfaction at his admission, only quiet compassion. Your mother doesn't want perfection, Mr. Whitmore. She wants you, not the businessman, not the man who carries his father's shadow, just you, her son. Daniel's throat tightened. He looked away, his jaw clenched. I don't know how to be that man. Grace stepped closer, her voice steady. Then start small. Sit with her when she wakes. Hold her hand, even when she doesn't recognize you. Let her see your presence, not your power. That's how trust is built. Not overnight, but moment by moment. Her words landed like a weight and a lifeline at once. He felt the sting of truth, but also the faint stir of possibility. He let out a breath that trembled despite his efforts. My father always told me emotions were weakness, that to care too deeply was to lose control. I've lived my whole life by that rule. Grace's eyes softened, but her voice did not waver. And where has it brought you? A house full of silence, a mother who fears being a burden, a son who doesn't know how to love without permission. Your father was wrong, Mr. Whitmore. Love is not weakness. It is the only strength that lasts. The words hit him harder than any boardroom defeat. He closed his eyes briefly, the old lessons warring against everything he had just seen, everything Grace had just spoken into the air. When he opened them again, his voice was quiet, stripped of armor. Then, will you show me how? Not as an employee, but as someone who knows her, someone she trusts. Grace studied him for a long moment, then slowly she nodded. I will, for her sake, and for yours. A silence settled between them, but it wasn't the heavy silence of before. It was softer, fragile, but alive, like the first breath of dawn. For the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore had asked for help, and for the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to learn how to be more than the man his father had made him.